Okay, well, let me say hello to everybody for this part of a series of Global Security Institute Zooms. The first one we did was with Ambassador Thomas Graham, and the second one was with Ambassador Robert Gray. And today we have the privilege of having a dialogue with Ambassador James Goodby. You know, I used to try cases as a lawyer in Philadelphia, and when you would put on a normal witness, they had to testify as to what they had direct evidence, what they'd seen, what they'd heard. But if you have an expert, they could give their opinion about something. And I don't think we could get any American diplomat with more qualifications to give an expert opinion on the subject of United States security, arms control, non-proliferation, and disarmament. And the role of diplomats in making the world safer and saner than Ambassador James Goodby. He has had an extremely amazing, broad, accomplished career as a diplomat and as a prolific author. He achieved the very senior rank in the State Department of Career Minister. He was an ambassador to Finland and held 3 other ambassadorial level assignments. He's held 2 positions as the rank of Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. He's advised several presidents directly on the most critical issues that we face. He was instrumental in really helping to build the modern Europe that we take for granted. And I guess the best evidence would be the opinion of another expert, former Secretary of Defense William Perry. And he said, in talking about Ambassador Goodby, Jim's life has been dedicated to serving the public and humanity. He is an unselfish individual who is touched by the needs of others and responds in a vigorous way to bring about change. So we're going to talk about some of the changes in the world that in which his hand was instrumental in helping to create. But first, I want to say hello, Ambassador.
Hello, Jonathan. Hello, everybody. Nice to see those of you I can see, and I see some old friends here.
Thank you so much for joining us, and people all over the world, former diplomats, current diplomats, people in ministries, students, interested people. I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful group of participants we have listening in. And we'll record this and share it with others. I'd like you to, first tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, where you went to college, and how you ended up in the Foreign Service.
Well, I'm a New Englander. I was born in Providence, Rhode Island, and grew up mainly in Haverhill, Massachusetts. Went to Haverhill High School, and then I went to Harvard College. And soon after that, I began a swift occupancy of jobs for a very short time. I became a Foreign Service officer. I became a geologist, which is the field I majored in, geology. Went into the military, and then I finally got back into the Atomic Energy Commission, where I stayed for almost 6 years, and then I went back into the State Department. So that was my early introduction to the way things work.
You grew up under the shadow of World War II in your formative years.
Right.
Did that war influence your career choices?
It absolutely did, Jonathan. I have looked back on that as really the major influence on my life, because I started out thinking that science was what was so important in the world, and I wanted to be a scientist. And no other occupation I thought was as important as being a scientist. And therefore, I first wanted to be an astronomer, and then I actually did become a geologist. But World War II and the effect it had of bringing the United States into the international arena in a big, big way, and the kind of problems that a war causes for ordinary people, of course, impressed me. So by the time I graduated from college, I had decided I really should spend part time on trying to make a better world. And I wasn't sure I could do that with geology, so I took the Foreign Service examination and luckily passed it and went into the Foreign Service.
You know, that's so interesting. I've often thought that we're so preoccupied with technical fixes to what are human communications problems. And nuclear weapons in many ways are sort of the example of that, where we're looking for a technical device to bring about ultimate state security and human security. And the paradox of nuclear weapons, in my opinion, is that the more we perfect the technology, the less of the goal of security we obtain. And presently, you know, as you know, our country alone spends over 700 billion on technical, basically military aspects to pursue security, and a decreasing pittance in diplomacy. And this distortion is taking place globally, where militaries are building up rather than building up the diplomatic corps. At the same time, because of the internet and because of modern communications, and largely because of the COVID virus, people all over the world are feeling a greater sense of human solidarity, of connectivity as people, not necessarily as nations, but as people. And your life has been a story in many ways of human intervention rather than technical to bring about security. And one of the themes that I saw in looking at, you know, studying your career was negotiating with people who were our existential enemies, poised to annihilate one another, the Soviet Union, and then becoming Russia. And I think that the story, if you could just tell us a little bit about the arc of your career of that interaction, because I think it's so revealing of the importance of what diplomats do.
Well, it began really in 1954 with what is called the Bravo Shot and the Castle series, to put it in AECE's Atomic Energy Commission. This was a nuclear test that was much larger. It was a thermonuclear test, one of the first, probably the first real serious test. And it was larger than had been anticipated, a scientific miscalculation, I like to call it, with the result that a lot of radioactivity was spread all over the Pacific Ocean. And I had just begun my brief career with the Atomic Energy Commission, and I was asked to do a report on that based on public sources. I think it was intended to be just an exercise for my own purposes, but I did that, and it impressed me with the fact that nuclear testing was a very serious problem and needed to be dealt with. And of course, it had the same impression on a lot of people around the world, with the result that the idea of banning at least thermonuclear tests became an issue in the 1956 elections. At least Stevenson adopted that as one of his platforms. And I began my work on the nuclear test ban, you could say, in that particular period, and because of a scientific miscalculation. So, and I continued working on that until 1963, when we finished working on a limited test ban treaty, which, of course, banned all nuclear tests except those underground. And I felt good about that, among other reasons, because I had two small children at that stage who were no longer condemned to drink milk with strontium-90 in it. So I was very pleased by that result personally, and for the global community as well.
But you had to, in your career, you had to negotiate directly with your counterparts in the Soviet Union in several instances.
Yeah.
And then with your counterparts in the successor state of Russia. What was that? First, what was that like psychologically, when the entire nation during the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s, and really for a short period of time in the 90s, we weren't, but now we're back to, you know, squaring off, demonizing one another, negotiating with the Russians, just like negotiating with the Soviets, was really very, very unpopular. People saw them as as if they were our enemies about to kill us,
You're
right?
right. Yeah. Well, I began that career really in 1955, and it accelerated in 1956. Uh, I began dealing mainly with Soviet scientists at that stage. Remember, I was in the Atomic Energy Commission. One of the first things I was involved in was working with a man named Shields Warren, who was a physician, and he was entrusted with the job of doing a report for the United Nations on the effects of radiation on human beings. And I was his assistant, and we met with a Russian counterpart and fairly seriously talked about that sort of thing for several weeks until the report was finally finished. The next thing I was involved in was helping to create what was called the draft statute of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And again, this was involving several Russian scientists, but also diplomats. And at that point in time, I began to get a little worried about this because this was a time when, of course, not Kennedy, but Joe McCarthy became a threat, if you will. And I began to worry, was I going to be reported to the FBI for talking with Russians, or something would happen of that along those lines? So it really was a kind of a scary time. But I persevered. I always made a point of informing the security people in the AEC of what was going on and so forth. So it was not a time when one would easily talk with your Russian counterparts about a serious issue like a nuclear weapons or a nuclear test ban or an IAEA. So those are the kinds of threats that I felt, and I'm afraid that people are beginning to think that way again, because we have this sort of adversarial relationship still with the Russian Federation, which is beginning to be like a Cold War atmosphere. And I suspect that people just beginning their careers are beginning to wonder if it's safe to negotiate or talk even with their Russian counterparts.
Well, you mentioned the Bravo test in 1954. I think people should get a sense of the scope of what you were talking about. I believe that test was turned out to be about 15 megatons of TNT. And Hiroshima was 15 kilotons, 15,000 tons of TNT. So a 1 megaton bomb would be the equivalent of what 70 Hiroshimas, at least 70. And then a 10 megaton bomb would be the equivalent of 700 Hiroshimas in one weapon. And a 15 would be somewhere around 1,200 Hiroshimas in one bomb. Now, I don't think the human mind can grasp the scale of such destruction.
But Jonathan, I was impressed even more by an even larger bomb that took place in 1961. Eisenhower had put into effect a moratorium on all testing in 1958, and there had been no testing between ourselves and the Soviet Union all that time. But in 1961, that moratorium was broken by a 50 megatons, some people say 55 megaton tests, what they call the Tsar Bomber, which was really huge, and of course made an impression not only on me, but also a lot of other people as well. So that is the largest nuclear test explosion ever conducted by anybody, and I suspect there is still some fallout around that is affecting people. It was such a big thing.
Yeah, well, that bomb we called it Little Joe, right?
I don't recall that, but anyway.
After Joe Stalin. Well, I know that one of the issues that the Soviets had with that test was figuring out how they could get the plane that dropped it to escape the explosion, and the pilots not getting absorbed in it. I don't believe that our imagination can conceive of such destructive capacity. And Another thing that was interesting in that period of time, in the way you would describe a little cooperation with the scientists, was the creation of Pugwash, the scientific organization of scientists working back and forth. Joseph Rotblat was one of the founders of the Global Security Institute, where I serve as president, and you're on the Nonpartisan Security Group. And scientists were meeting in Pugwash, Nova Scotia, very quietly, to, you know, Soviet and Western scientists. But I discovered recently that there was enormous cooperation amongst the medical community, scientific medical community, all the way back in the 50s, all the way until recently, to address pandemic diseases. And it was that cooperation that was instrumental in empowering the World Health Organization to get rid of polio and smallpox. And that this was really under the radar of the public, because the public perception was these great militaries squaring off. And one of the things that I think has helped make the world safer was an institution you mentioned that you were very involved in helping to create, which was the International Atomic Energy Agency. People don't know what that is and how it came about and why and how there were people who made it, you being one of them. So could you tell about what that agency does and what you did to help make it come into being?
Yeah. Well, the credit goes in the first instance to Dwight Eisenhower, who gave a speech not too long after he came into office at the United Nations in the fall of 1953, in which he proposed an International Atomic Energy Agency. In effect, he thought of it as a kind of a bank for fuel, where people who wanted to move into the peaceful uses of atomic energy would be able to draw on the fuel that would be stored by this international bank. It soon went well beyond that and ultimately became the vehicle for confirming that countries were in fact living up to the obligations of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which had not yet been negotiated but was several years later. And fortunately, it turned out there was an International Atomic Energy Agency that could do the verification of that agreement. So the IAEA still has a lot of potential for growth, and I've always been pushing it to become a more scientific kind of operation. I did at the very beginning, but was rebuffed, but has now moved quite seriously, I think, in that direction, and is the basis now, I think, for a lot of other things that go into the monitoring of nuclear, not just test explosions, but all kinds of nuclear activities.
Well, so in your opinion, if there was an agreement to get rid of nuclear weapons, knowing what we know from the International Atomic Energy Agency's inspection capacity, which when you look at the budget of that agency compared to the budgets of building and deploying the weapons, is almost embarrassingly small. But are we technically capable of ensuring a nuclear weapons-free world?
Well, of course, that's debatable. My feeling is yes, it is, and it's not just because there is an IAEA, but if you are a country that has a small stockpile, let's say, of nuclear weapons, and you want to conceal them, you can't just put them in a cave and then go away and never go back again, because it doesn't work that way. You have to maintain them, and so it requires intelligence, not just scientific work, but intelligence activities that would determine what was going on in a particular cave, and that people going in and out were likely doing something that had to do with nuclear weapons. So based on the technology, but also on the intelligence activities and national technical means supplemented by some kind of an international agreement to provide for challenge inspections, at least, which the existing Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, not yet ratified, would provide if it were ratified. Those are the things that enable you to move into a world in which nuclear weapons are abolished. I think you have to go at it gradually, and which is what we are all basically talking about. And you have to go at it with an eye towards possible cheating by somebody, not necessarily one of the big major powers, but maybe some smaller group, maybe even a terrorist group, might have a nuclear weapon that they stole from somewhere. So it is a major job, but I think it is technically feasible, supplemented by other kinds of things.
One of the the so-called deal with Iran, the JCPOA, which is actually a Security Council resolution and not just merely negotiations for a real estate contract that you walk away from, but it provided very intrusive inspections and verification of the conduct of Iran. And I've always thought that this should be the international standard, that we should have additional protocols of inspections under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but then have a Security Council resolution saying that this kind of intrusive verification to ensure the security and safety of nuclear arsenals is a universal requirement, very much like Resolution 1540 of the Security Council, compelling every nation in the world to have domestic laws to address sub-state actors producing chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. Why not have a Security Council resolution on the strengthening an international safeguard regime? I don't see any cost that would come of that. Nobody's security would be diminished. What are the arguments against that?
I don't think there are any strong arguments against that, but what one needs to think about is the fact that nuclear weapons do not exist in a vacuum. They exist because of some kind of a threat that a country perceives, or some kind of prestige that a country thinks it might achieve by having nuclear weapons. And so what I think we need to recognize is that a nuclear agreement always has to be accompanied by some kind of political change. This was done during the Reagan administration, for example. It would have to be done now if we were to negotiate seriously with Russia. I think we'd have to also recognize we can't continue in this kind of a semi-Cold War status, because agreements based simply on technical achievements and technical arrangements are not likely to be successful. I felt at the very beginning, when the nuclear agreement with Iran was achieved, that unless it moved fairly quickly into covering other aspects of arrangements in the Middle East, like terrorism, nuclear delivery systems, and that sort of thing, that might not succeed. I had not anticipated it would be broken off the way it was by the United States, but I do think that you have to consider that these technical arrangements, which you began by talking about yourself, Jonathan, it has to be accompanied by political changes.
And part of that process of political changes are called confidence building measures, right?
Could be, yeah, right. Although it goes beyond that.
When diplomats talk about confidence building measures, I mean, I think a lot of people think it's like, please pass the shrimp. But it's more than just receptions at embassies. What do people mean by confidence building measures?
Usually they refer to greater transparency as between military services, exercises, for example, that are which are mounted without any warning can cause concerns about surprise attack. And so therefore one aspect of a confidence building measure that we have put into place in Europe especially has to do with giving advance notification of military out-of-garrison activities. Other things have to do with getting into the nuclear arena, have to do with launching of missiles, ballistic missiles especially. And there are agreements in effect that we are parties to, and more that we could be parties to. For example, I would think that we might be able to get into an agreement with China. Russia has an agreement with China. We have an agreement with Russia, and people have advocated combining those two agreements and having a joint U.S., China, Russia advanced notification of ballistic missile tests agreement. I think that would be an excellent idea. Another aspect of it is incidents at sea, as they call it. The U.S. and Soviet navies towards the end of the Cold War reached an agreement where they would meet periodically and they would discuss arrangements to make sure that when navies are operating in close proximity to one another, if some incident occurred, there would be procedures in place to to de-escalate it so it would not be taken as the beginning of a conflict. So those are all the kinds of confidence building measures, and many of them could be put into place with China, where we do not have them presently in any serious way. And I think also with North Korea, for that matter. So I think there is a big agenda for confidence building measures, which could be accomplished fairly easily and fairly quickly, I think.
You had some experience in building military confidence between militaries. Could you describe, what that's like to bring together, military professionals who a few weeks earlier, or maybe even when they're coming together, are at the ready to annihilate and kill one another, and then bringing them together to actually build relationships that increase security for both sides?
Yeah. Well, a good example of what you're talking about is something I was involved in, which was what was called the Stockholm Conference, which was a part of I hate to go into this gibberish, but the Helsinki Final Act was negotiated and signed in 1975, and it had a lot of follow-on activity, one of which was to build confidence-building measures between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, including also the countries that were neutral in Europe in those days. And so we met 35 countries, some members of NATO, some members of the Warsaw Pact. It was run by ambassadors like me, but the military had a very big role in this. In fact, when I took the job, I was handed a list of kinds of confidence building measures the military thought would be useful. They were all very technical. They all had to do with out of garrison activities. They involved how many troops would have to be out of a garrison to qualify for notification, things of that type. And I said to myself, well, this will never get much public support. So I decided how to package that and sell it, was to say that this is to prevent the war that nobody wants. In other words, an accidental war might happen because of some military activity that was not intended to be the beginning of an attack, but might look like one. And so on that basis, we secured an agreement. The military was very good about that. They had some excellent ideas. Again, they were very technical ideas about numbers and so forth, which I don't think the average person would follow or understand as how important it was. But we did reach an agreement, and it went into effect, and subsequently other agreements went into effect as well, including discussions about military doctrine, military budgets, and so forth. Now, a lot of that has gone by the wayside because of the problems we have in Europe, but in principle, all of that is still very, very relevant and could be emulated in other parts of the world. I've been advocating for quite a long time that there be something like this in Northeast Asia, for example. Japan, Russia, China, North and South Korea could, in my view, easily do that, and that would make a big difference in terms of the relationships there.
I've been working and advocating that between India and Pakistan, which I think is the greatest danger the world faces, should there be a hacker creating the perception of a launch between them.
Right.
They don't have adequate time to evaluate whether it's a computer error or a renegade general or an accidental launch. But in the point you were making about missile launches and notification, I'm reminded of the weather satellite that was launched off the coast of Norway in 1995, and Boris Yeltsin opened the so-called football, and he was told he had 8 minutes before a electromagnetic pulse of an explosion would take place over Moscow, trying the command and control. And his response was that he wasn't worried, really, because of his human relationship with Bill Clinton. But we didn't have the adequate crisis control center, which, as you know, myself and Bill Perry and Ambassador Graham and David Koplow and others are advocating, a crisis control center in which there could be protocols for validating and addressing such mishaps. So, we sit in a world today in which the institutionalization of addressing a computer error, it's still pretty ad hoc. We don't have the sufficient institutional checks, in my opinion. And to quote Ronald Reagan, 6 minutes to decide whether it's a computer era or a launch and decide the future of the world is insane. And people don't realize that, that Ronald Reagan and George Shultz, conservative, helping to move the world from the 14,000 today. You had direct experiences with that process, and you had direct experiences with President Reagan on this subject. This is something of, it's really so interesting that you not only had the political part of it with the president, but then you were involved in the technical application of doing it, of actually helping to get rid of the arsenal. Could you describe that process, sort of like meeting with President Reagan and then moving to actually getting rid of these weapons?
Yeah. I did meet with Ronald Reagan in the Oval Office, I guess 4 or 5 times probably. And in the beginning, I was not really convinced that this very conservative guy that I disagreed with in quite a lot of things was really for real in terms of what he was saying about nuclear weapons. At one point, I said to him in kind of in a sarcastic way, for some reason, people don't really like nuclear weapons very much. I was being kind of a wise guy, and he understood that, and he looked at me very sternly. And he said, "You go out and tell people that I'm willing to go as far as anybody else in getting rid of nuclear weapons." Well, that impressed me. He looked serious. And I talked to other people at the time, Paul Nitze, for example, who knew him, of course, a lot better than I did. And he said, yes, he is serious. And he said he's more or less like Harry Truman. He's very blunt. He's very determined in what he wants to achieve. And he doesn't understand necessarily all the technicalities of it, but he's out to get something done about eliminating nuclear weapons. And he means it. And I became convinced that he did. And I think that was made very clear in the famous Reagan-Gorbachev summit meeting that took place in 1986 in Reykjavik, Iceland, where, of course, George Shultz also played a very prominent part. 1986 turned out to be the peak year for numbers of nuclear weapons in the world. And instead of just being another year, 1986, now we can look back on it as a time when nuclear weapons started decreasing in numbers. And by the way, the recent agreements that we've achieved in this previous administration have brought the world down from 1994, when the first START agreement went into effect, with about 12,000 apiece. Now we have 1,550 nuclear weapons apiece. That's quite a substantial drop from 1994 to 2020 to have that kind of a disarmament. I mean, in terms of the explosive power, that's an enormous, probably the largest nuclear or largest reduction in nuclear explosive power ever, or any kind of explosive power ever achieved. The military are extremely important, though. You mentioned that it was Yeltsin who decided this and that, but in fact, it was a relatively junior military guy who decided it probably was not a real attack, and therefore didn't do the things that he could have done probably to react to that. So we do rely very, very heavily now on our nuclear experts in the military, and I think we should probably try to relieve their burden somewhat by confidence building measures and having other procedures in place that does not put so much of a burden on the shoulders to decide in 6 minutes, as you said, whether something is a real attack or not.
We went from over 65,000 down to what we have, and you mentioned after the START process. How did we get? There's tens of thousands in between. How did we get rid of those, and how were you involved in that process?
Well, I was involved in I think you're talking about the Nunn-Luger Agreements, which went into effect in 1992. It was designed essentially to help the Russian Federation, which by that time was getting into a deep financial trouble, designed to help them implement the START agreement. So the money for that, the funds for it, came out of the Defense Department budget, and that was agreed to by legislation sponsored by Senators Nunn and Lugar, Republican, Democrat and Republican. I was the head of the delegation that was asked to go to Moscow, to Minsk, to Almaty at that point, capital of Kazakhstan, and to Ukraine, Kiev, and to negotiate agreements to provide them support, not money, in so many words, but technical support. Essentially, we were willing to fund contractors, mainly U.S. contractors in the beginning, to help them dismantle nuclear weapons, which meant there were procedures in place that would require them to take apart nuclear missiles, take apart nuclear bombers. And we have not had an agreement to date that actually says take apart nuclear warheads themselves. We have now limits on the numbers of nuclear weapons, but it's done by counting how many weapons are deployed. And there's no agreement in place to actually monitor the destruction of nuclear weapons. I tried to do that, and others have too, in the past. And there are ways of doing that, which could be quite successful, I think, in terms of monitoring. But as of now, the only thing we dismantle is actually the delivery vehicles. But that was an important thing to do, and so far as I think is still the case, the Russians are living up to the terms, most of the terms, let's say, of Neustadt, and the extension of Neustadt, I should think, would be an easy call, but for some reason this country has not yet agreed to do that.
I understand that a great amount of the material from the former Soviet weapons was converted into usable fuel for nuclear energy. Is that true?
Yes, it is true. It was negotiated with the Russians to transform 500 metric tons of highly enriched uranium into uranium that could be usable for nuclear reactors. The blending down of that highly enriched uranium was done in Russia, but Senator Nunn, who had a lot to do with, and Jim Timby as well, who was maybe on this call, may not be, but he had quite a lot to do with that negotiation too. In fact, was key, I would say, in getting the technical aspects of that in place. In any case, Senator Nunn was very fond of saying that 1 in 10 light bulbs is powered by a dismantled nuclear bomb from Russia, which is an interesting way to put it, but more or less true.
If more people knew that we're technically capable of taking a nuclear bomb and turning it into electricity that lights up our homes, how much safer we are using diplomacy to get rid of our adversaries' bombs that were pointed at us than threatening to seize them or some madness such as that.
Too true.
Yeah. As of now, as you know, we have we'll get to this, basically a decimated diplomatic corps, and a policy of walking away from treaties, which I consider very serious as a constitutional scholar. Americans don't realize that Article 6 of the U.S. Constitution, Clause 2, makes treaties the supreme law of the land. And using that term, our founding fathers, they wanted treaties to be much more important than they'd ever been before. It was an ought, kind of like an ought that we should be pursuing, like the ought of we hold these truths to be self-evident. That was hardly an is when it was put forward, but it's something we need to strive for. We need to strive for a world in which there's true equality of all peoples, of races, genders, colors, creeds, etc. And when it was said by Jefferson, it didn't include people of color, men without property, white or colored, and indigenous people, or even women. But we now know it's grown. So the ought with with nuclear policy, the ought that Reagan put into place in Reykjavik with Gorbachev, we ought to do everything to strive toward a diplomatic solution. The World Court has unanimously said we have to do this. And one of the areas that just seems like a no-brainer to me that you were involved in from the very beginning is the ought of ensuring that we don't explode any more nuclear bombs in the ground, in the atmosphere, anywhere, forever. Just give us a little history of the movement towards stopping the testing, explosions of nuclear bombs from the beginning to where we are today, because you were involved in this in the whole history of stopping testing.
Yeah. Well, the ought, I remember Max Campbellman very well, who liked to talk about the power of the ought, and he was absolutely right. And that's why I think that agreements that are essentially normative in effect are important to have. And it may be possible for us to negotiate those kinds of things fairly quickly with China, for example. We were talking to some Chinese just the other day who suggested something like that. So the power of the ought is real, and I think needs to be exploited more than it has been. Yes, one of the last things I did in the nuclear test ban field was to work with John Shalikashvili, who had recently retired as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And the two of us were asked if we would talk with the senators who had just recently refused to give their consent to ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which was unfortunate, but that's what they did. So the two of us went to Capitol Hill. We talked with almost, I think, all of the people who had voted against the ratification, mainly Republicans. And we talked with a lot of leaders from the Democratic side as well. And we came up with some ideas that we thought were pretty reasonable. This was in the last year of the Clinton administration. He was about to leave office, in fact. The two of us and others as well, Nancy Gallagher, who sometimes is with this group, and I and others went to see the president in the Oval Office. In fact, he took us into a side office for this meeting. And we briefed him on what we had found. And what we did find was that there was a lot of support for the idea that I thought we could achieve through a test ban, namely to try to freeze things so that other countries could not acquire the expertise it takes that we had acquired ourselves through a large number of tests. So if you can limit countries to fairly simple nuclear weapons, you're much better off than if you're going to allow them to continue to develop many more sophisticated techniques. So we briefed the president on that. We also had, by the way, said there ought to be a review maybe after 10 years of the implementation of the treaty, and the Senate can manage that. We basically were willing to give the Senate some authority that wasn't necessarily given to them by the Constitution, but we thought it was necessary to get them involved in these things. So a lot of ideas we had that we presented to President Clinton in this report, and he seemed to be impressed, and he said he would talk to the incoming president, who of course was George W. Bush, and because he felt that positions that countries that the presidents took in their campaign to gain office wasn't necessarily what they would want to do when they got in office. In any case, nothing ever happened, and the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty is still unratified, which is one of the major disasters of arms control, in my view, and a reason that we have so many problems today with these things that we see happening in China and Russia, violations of the moratorium or whatever. In any case, yes, I think the test ban is still an important thing to do, and there are ways of doing it that I think are quite compatible with our national security. In fact, our national security is enhanced if we could get a treaty with all the provisions in it that are in the agreed Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which is signed by a great many countries, including us.
Including our two of our main allies, France and the United Kingdom.
Yeah,
and Russia not only signed but ratified by those countries. So
that's right.
it's really not that heavy a lift
That's
if
right.
the
And
United States would do it.
of course, it will help us quite a bit with non-proliferation. And I'm thinking especially of North Korea when I say that, because, of course, they can always say, well, you have never ratified. Why should we do this?
Yeah, it not only undermines the logic of our security, it undermines one of the promises inherent in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty,
That's right.
which is a fully ratified
Yeah.
treaty that mentions it specifically.
Right.
Um, so, you know, I noticed we have some really wonderful people. I noticed, you know, in this Zoom, one of the people that I noticed is Tom Countryman, who is a very distinguished diplomat in this field as well. I just wanted to recognize, you know, I wanted to recognize another leader in this field. But you're in another level, Ambassador Goodby, because you have the scope of longevity. And I want to get to one thing that for me, it's so unappreciated.
Before you do that, though, let me also say there are two other people that I see, Piers Corden and Ed Ift. Both of them have quite a lot to do with not only arms control in general, but specifically with the test ban. So we have a quorum here to talk about the test ban if you want to go on for another few hours.
Well, and Piers Corden is instrumental in being part of the Holy Seas delegation in all the important arms control treaties. But there's something that's unique here that you were instrumental in that I just want to put it in perspective. The 30 Years' War in Europe was ended in 1648 by the Councils of Westphalia, the Treaties of Westphalia, essentially creating the modern states of Europe. There is not a similar level of negotiations of the relationships between these countries in that region until 1975 in Finland, in Helsinki. And you were instrumental in that. And I think that what was negotiated to create the modern Europe, first was Europe itself is really created by Westphalia, but modern Europe is created in Helsinki in 75. I think it's really, is that your phone?
It is, yeah, go ahead. Doesn't bother you, doesn't bother me.
Yeah, reality TV.
Yeah.
Share with us a little bit about what happened in Helsinki in 1975 and why it's so important.
Yeah. Well, this goes back to 1968, when you may recall the Prague Spring. The Communist Party in Prague simply wanted to have a more, what they called socialism with a human face, something of that along those lines. And that was anathema to Moscow because they saw it as the first step on the way to breaking out of the NATO, or rather out of the Warsaw Pact. And Brezhnev, who was the general secretary at that time, was appalled by this idea that they wanted socialism with a human face, and it amounted to what he considered to be a heresy, and therefore the Warsaw Pact invaded Czechoslovakia and put down this government. And I think the man who was in charge was taken to Moscow and summarily executed. In any case, the Soviet Union understood that they had caused a problem, but they saw a way out of it. They had, for a long time, been advocating something that they thought of as an all-European conference on security. And they thought that this would be a way in which they could ratify the post-war borders and at the same time avoid all of the criticism they were getting from their invasion of Czechoslovakia. We saw an opportunity here because in 1969 we were ready to begin détente. NATO had agreed to that whole idea, but we thought we could strike a deal where, yes, we would agree to borders, but we would also require there to be some other things attached to this agreement, the foremost of which would be the freer movement of people, information, and ideas.
Mm.
In other words, we wanted to say that this is an agreement not only between states and the way they behave, but also the way states behave towards their own people. And we pursued that with the support of our allies in NATO. And I was involved in that because I had been sent there to become the political counselor to Donald Rumsfeld. And Donald Rumsfeld supported this idea and supported what we were doing in the senior political committee at that point to negotiate positions that NATO would take into a negotiation with the Warsaw Pact, and of course, first and foremost, with Moscow. And we worked on that I think it was in 1993 or 1992 for quite a long time, and finally came up with a very good package, which included the idea of freer movement of people, information, and ideas. There was some angst within the NATO community about this, and the Germans in particular were a little bit worried and said, well, let's just limit this to cultural relations. But with the support of the Dutch and some other good, strong allies, we finally persuaded all of the allies that we needed to have that kind of an agreement that would be subscribed to if we were going to agree to the post-war borders, which was actually a major concession by us. We also required that there be peaceful change of frontiers would be allowed, meaning that East and West Germany could be united if they agreed to do that. So we thought we had covered all our bases, and we went into a negotiation with the Soviet Union. Why did they accept all these things? Well, they thought they'd never have to implement them. They thought they had adequate control over Eastern Europe, so they would not be faced with the problem that they actually did get faced with, which is countries that signed that agreement took it pretty seriously. And in Czechoslovakia especially, they really meant what they said when they said, we signed this agreement and we intend to carry out its provision, meaning we do want to have freer movement of people, information, and ideas. We want to have the right of people, not just countries and states. Why did the Russians accept that? First of all, because I said they didn't expect it to happen, but also because I think they felt that there really wouldn't be that much appeal to these ideas in Eastern Europe. They just would pass away. I have to admit to you that our Secretary of State at the time, Henry Kissinger, also thought this should disappear fairly quickly. And what he favored was, of course, a continuation of the status quo. He thought that would be preferable to getting into a war in Central Europe. And of course, he was right on that. But what he didn't support or didn't understand, I think, was the idea that change could happen. And change did happen because the people in Eastern Europe understood what was permitted to them and given to them by this agreement. And they pushed hard for it, with the result that we had basically revolutions from the bottom up in Eastern Europe. And finally, there was the end of the Warsaw Pact. And I think it came about largely because of the miscalculation that Brezhnev made in thinking nothing would happen. And it also became possible because we supported it as well. In those days, we were strong supporters of human rights, and there were, in the provisions of the Helsinki Final Act, there were requirements for monitoring implementation. And every 5 years, we would have a conference of that type, and we'd add new ideas about human rights in it. And most of the time, they were accepted. Confidence building majored as well. So I think that is what happened. And I think you're absolutely right in describing, there's a walnut falling in my roof. And I think you're absolutely right in describing this as the 20th century equivalent of the 1648 agreement. And when the Soviet Union invaded Crimea and parts of Ukraine, I felt this was the sort of the end of that particular era. And something new has to be done, or else this particular agreement has to be reaffirmed. It has not been formally reaffirmed. I'd like to see it reaffirmed, or else something else put in its place, because we now are again in a situation where nobody's quite sure about where the frontiers are and what's going to happen. So thanks for asking that question.
I think that's very important. I mean, people, we're living in a time in which we think of the news cycles. But if you look at the movement of real history, the reality of states, the reality of how ideas take root. The 75 Helsinki Accords not only addressed tangible policies of the moment, but they articulated a set of values around which our concept of the purpose of government in the West took hold.
That's right.
And that set of values, I don't believe are Western or Eastern. I believe they are, in fact, universal. You'll never find a author who suffered torture at the hands of a tyrant under a authoritarian regime arguing that fundamental human rights and liberties are relative. You'll never find anyone who has been summarily incarcerated arguing that human rights are relative. This argument that fundamental freedoms embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which were the backbone of the Helsinki Accords, those are universal norms that we have to, that they come from the very values that make us Americans. And I'm deeply concerned today that those values that are the why of our nation, those principles are at risk. That's another discussion outside of what you have been qualified and what I'm qualified to talk about as an expert, which is arms control treaties. But we as human beings are, I know you're offended by the lack of our countries supporting movements for human rights and liberty and supporting authoritarian dictators. Since you left the government and where we are today, you have been tireless in writing books. I know you were very much involved in the series of important editorials penned under the names of Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State George Shultz, Senator Sam Nunn, and former Secretary of Defense William Perry, in which they argue powerfully for the principle of the abolition of nuclear weapons. I wanted to ask you, before I open it up to some of our distinguished people on this Zoom to interact and ask a question, where are we today, and where do we need to go? Where are we today? What are the challenges today, and what are some of the solutions to improve the world today?
Yeah. Well, thank you. First, let me give the credit for the authoring of those op-eds to the people who actually signed them, because they were heavily involved. I was in and out of it, and others were as well, but the credit goes to those people who put their names to it, for Cold War warriors, if you will, and they supported an agreement that would lead to a world without nuclear weapons, and that was quite courageous of them. What we need to do today, I think, first of all, is to extend the life of the Neustadt Treaty. This is the one that has brought down the numbers of nuclear weapons finally to 1,550 each between Russia and the United States. That agreement expires in February next year, 2021. It needs to be extended, and it can be extended under the terms of the treaty for 5 years. And that 5 years would buy us some time of stability to go beyond what the Neustadt accomplished. There are new technologies that have come about. Some of them are really quite dangerous, I think, and some of them require separate agreements that are fairly complex in nature. I'm thinking about agreements like those that deal with cyber war, some of those that deal with artificial intelligence, for example. These are technologies that we cannot deal with simply by saying, well, we can deter that by having our own cyber war and our own kind of activities involving artificial intelligence. Space is another area, by the way. So I think we need to move out of the nuclear, well, I won't say out of, but beyond the nuclear realm and into these other technologies, which I think are probably going to be dealt with by arrangements sort of like an incidents at sea agreement, something like the agreements that we already have in the confidence building arena, where you would have a general normative approach, but also a way of talking about what we consider to be wrong about what the other side is doing. In other words, some kind of implementation arrangement, which almost all agreements, including the Non-Proliferation Treaty, have a review conference, in other words. I would advocate a fairly frequent review conference in the case of agreements having to do with space and cyber war and the artificial intelligence, because those fields are moving very, very rapidly, and we're not really able to deal with them. The diplomacy is far out distanced by the technology that's proceeding at full speed. So that's what I would advocate. I think we can move on to deeper reductions in nuclear warheads, and I would advocate doing that once we have the negotiation already achieved that brought us down to 1550. Once that has been extended, there are many other things that could be done, including nuclear. But I just want to mention that there are these other areas, 3 of them in particular, that I think could be negotiated. Some of which could include China as well. And I think we do need to include China in this. They are a major power, and I think that the discussions that some of us have had with them suggest that there are things that could be done that would bring them into some kind of arms control arrangements, not the kind that necessarily that we have with the Russians, but some that would would make the world a safer place, to put it simply.
Well, they've expressed a willingness to negotiate a treaty to prevent the weaponization of space, as have the Russians, but we're not negotiating anything about that. But I think that the work that you've done with Secretary Shultz to validate the importance of the principle of abolition is very important. And I want a little full disclosure. Both you and I and Secretary Shultz are in a wonderful video called "The Nuclear Prayer," where we're asking for a little extra help in this. And I want to commend that to anyone's attention, Nuclear Prayer, because we're in a group of Voices for a Nuclear Weapons-Free World with an interfaith initiative that Bishop Bill Swing helped put together. Other people in that group are Ambassador Graham and Secretary Perry, and literally hundreds of thousands of people the world over in the United Religions Initiative. And recently, that group helped create a coalition of 4 interfaith organizations, which did a terrific video with Secretary Shultz and Mikhail Gorbachev, the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Mohammed El-Baradei, the former head of the International Atomic Energy Agency and a Nobel Peace Laureate, Beatrice Finn, who helped win a Nobel Prize with the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, and Dr. Zerbo of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization. And I had the privilege of introducing Secretary Shultz, your very good friend, and President Gorbachev in it. And I got to say about them that there are many people in this, you can get this video at the United Religions Initiative website, that many people, including yourself, Ambassador, were deeply involved in making history. But it's fair to say that what they put in motion at Reykjavik, or actually in Geneva, in which they affirmed that a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought, and that they wouldn't seek military advantage over one another. I think it would be fair to say that they saved history, because we were on a trajectory that was going only toward destruction. And I think you were one of a handful of people who got us out of that conundrum, and got us out of the conundrum of actually moving toward the Cold War fully being a hot war.
Well, Jonathan, let me give credit to you for that Hiroshima project, because I know you had a lot to do with getting it going. And I had a small part in it. I had the honor of reading a letter from George Shultz. So if you watch it, you can hear my voice. But I think it was really a very moving film. I really was moved to tears myself several times, mainly by watching the effects of this bomb on Hiroshima. And you can still watch it.
Well,
I think it's on YouTube.
It's on the Global Security Institute's website. It's right there. You go to gsinstitute.org. And there you can also see the Nonpartisan Security Group, which is the successor of the Bipartisan Security Group, which we had, which was very active when we had some bipartisan cooperation in the U.S. government. What we found now is that the current Republican Party, which seems to be the one-party system, they don't want to talk with anybody.
Yeah.
And so we've changed it to the nonpartisan security group. I think that we're in a moment, Ambassador, where people have to really come to grips with the fact that the current administration has really been quite radical in walking away from the very institutions of the United Nations system, of the normative value of treaties, of living up to the commitments we made under treaties, the very dignity and honor of our country. And that moving toward a nuclear weapons-free world, or moving toward any kind of a safe world, requires strengthening these institutions. Would you agree with where we are in this moment on that subject?
Yeah, I think there's no important agreement that can be accomplished that deals with existential threats like nuclear war, climate change, pandemics. You have to do that in a multilateral setting, in a global setting, essentially. And it's fairly urgent we do this, because if we can see from the pandemic how dangerous it is to be unprepared for it, and how dangerous it is not to have an organization globally to deal with these things effectively, and how dangerous it is not to be able to conduct even bilateral negotiations or discussions with other countries effectively. So we do really have to move fairly rapidly on that. And I think whatever administration comes into office rather, in January, really does have to put a higher priority, very high priority on these things. Let me mention one final thing before we get distracted, and that is, I think, Jonathan, you have found your calling in these videos that you've been producing. And it reminds me that there was a video audio that you sent to me, and I want to thank you for that, because it had to do with what radio was like in 1945, the time of the first nuclear explosions. And I was very moved by it because it took me back to my youth. It also reminded me of songs that I like to hear. One of them was by your mother, Katie Callan, who was featured in that. And I have to tell you, I thank you very much for sending that. It brought me back to my high school years, which rarely happens. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, well, my mother was right there in the cusp of history. The iconic kiss when the boys came back from World War II, the soundtrack is always "Kiss Me Once and Kiss Me Twice," and that's my mother singing.
Yeah.
And then and my dad was my dad was also very involved in the sort of the interplay of history and show business. I can remember being 12 years old, and my dad was a publicist, among other things, and he helped the careers of people like Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis and Doris Day. And I can remember he brought me to a political rally. I was 12 years old. I had no appreciation for what was going on. But all of a sudden, I found myself on the stage with John F. Kennedy and Frank Sinatra. But as I grew older, I came to realize how unbelievably unrecognized the public just doesn't recognize the extraordinary importance of the work that diplomats do. I mean, we wouldn't have won the American Revolution without the diplomacy of Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. We would not have the modern world in which literally billions have been lifted out of gross poverty without the work of diplomats. And no matter how much money we spend on militaries, it's never as good as changing the human relations between states. And so I just want to say very publicly, Ambassador Goodby, on behalf of so many people, thank you. Thank you for the work that you've done your whole life and for continuing to do this. I mean, I commend to everyone's attention your essay with Stephen Pfeiffer on the joint enterprise of getting negotiations going amongst the countries with nuclear weapons to fulfill their commitment on disarmament. I think the roadmap you lay out in that essay is absolutely essential. You can find it at the Global Security Institute's website. It's in a book that you did. Which was that book?
The War That Must Never Be Fought.
And who's the co-author?
George Shultz, co-editor.
Co-editor, a Republican, I highlight.
Yeah.
I see we have Ambassador Tom Countryman on the call, and I'd like to recognize him for sure. He is another great American diplomat. Ambassador Countryman, please.
Thanks. Not in the same league, Jim Goodby, but two quick comments. It's true that people who have suffered under communism are not likely to argue that human rights are a relative concept. The exception, of course, is Viktor Orban in Hungary. The other comment is historical. Absolutely fascinating discussion of the Tsar Bomba from 1961. And just recently, the Russians declassified a 40-minute long video that shows the entire process of preparing, dropping, aftermath. It is scary as hell, a mushroom cloud 60 kilometers high. You can find it at the website called thebarentsobserver.com, B-A-R-E-N-T-S. And if you're historically minded or you just like great big booms, I can strongly recommend it.
I saw that video. It just came out, and I was thinking we'll put it on the Global Security Institute's website to say that if we don't come back to the root of diplomacy, if we don't come back to strengthening these institutions, inevitably this is where things are going to go. And it may not go with a big bomb, but it'll go with another technology that will be equally destructive. My concern is that science, I mean, the bomb is a 1930s physics and a 1940s technology. And as far as I know, DARPA and other similar institutions that do advanced weapon design, they haven't been in retirement all these decades. They must have some interesting things on the shelf. Nanotechnologies, electromagnetic pulses, well, things like physics that I can't even imagine. And so one of the things that with nukes is that nukes are pretty clumsy. We can identify them. We know what they do. They're only in the hands of 9 countries. So there's a real urgency, I think, to get back on track, give the ball to people like yourself with the skills of negotiating, and strengthen the constraints on science. Would you agree with that, Ambassador?
Well, I have a hesitation in saying impose constraints on science. I think that's impossible. But
maybe not. I'm sorry. Impose constraints on the technological applications of the uses of science for destructive purposes.
All right, now you're becoming like a negotiator. Thank you. Thank you. We can remove the brackets from your sentence now.
We have some interns, some Global Security Institute interns on the call, and I wondered if any of them wanted to ask you any questions. I know, for example, Vittorio Aguirre is a very, very sharp guy. Vittorio, do you have any questions of Ambassador?
Yes. First of all, thank you so much, Ambassador, for a very interesting talk. And I would have a question about the US. So in the US, what would be an effective reform to take the sole authority to launch a nuclear attack out of the hands of a single person, which is the president?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you're right in saying that U.S. presidents have an enormous amount of power when it comes to nuclear weapons. It's not just the launching, but it's also the decisions about targeting, they approve. Decisions about the types of weapons we have, they approve. Almost every facet, I would say entirely every facet of nuclear weapons development, production, numbers, and so forth, things that they approve and they're asked to accept. I think the first step would be for them to take a more rational approach to this. And there have been times in our history when presidents actually have done that. I think that there were presidents who decided they needed to have more input themselves in some of these procedures. So I think this is a little bit like Article 25, the amendment to the U.S. Constitution having to do with removing the power of a president if he becomes ill. It probably almost requires some kind of a constitutional amendment, but there are, in fact, people who are trying to draft legislation that say a president cannot decide to be the first to use nuclear weapons. And I think the Democratic platform this year, as I understand it, does have something that says that there should the use of nuclear weapons should be reserved to deter the use of nuclear weapons by other countries. That would place constraints on presidents as well. So it would be a complicated thing to do because the whole procedure is set up in case of a surprise attack. Presidents ought to be able to do something to respond. But there has to be some kind of limits on how that's done. And of course, the best thing of all would be to get rid of nuclear weapons and not be faced with that problem.
I would hate to see a nuclear war begun by tweet.
Yes.
I noticed, and he doesn't have his hand up, but I just feel I need to recognize Ambassador Paul Meyer from Canada, who's on this call. And if you'd like to comment, we'd appreciate it. He was very instrumental.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan.
Building middle power humanity that's been silenced. Middle powers being really an important part of the world that we need for the future. Countries that have not followed the path of getting nuclear weapons, have good records on human rights, and whose security largely depends on an international order of law. And you were instrumental in having Canada being a leading voice of that. Could you, before you ask, the ambassador, I have a question for you. Can we get middle powers back in the game?
Yeah, I think, of course, we can, and we've already had some signs of leadership being demonstrated, for example, by Sweden and Germany just in the last year or so. And of course, those countries that were key in bringing about the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons include Austria and Norway. It's, I think, a great example of how, particularly in multilateral diplomacy, size doesn't matter. If you have a powerful idea whose time has come, even if you're a representative of a more modest country.
Oh, you froze on us. There. Paul,
coming forward, particularly as Ambassador Goodby has flagged already, there are new complicating threats on top of the nuclear in terms of cyber, in terms of militarization relating to outer space, or prospect of weaponization. These are things that we should have diplomatic counters to going forward.
Thank you. I see also we have the chair of the International Law Section of the American Bar Association, which is on record, by the way. The whole ABA is on record in supporting ratification of the Test Ban Treaty. So we have no one to negotiate. There's really nobody to talk to lobby at this point. Joe, do you want to say anything about the role of the American Bar Association in this matter?
Thank you, Jonathan. I think you identified ABA policy and you know where that stands. As a chair of a section, it's not for me to say where the ABA policy is, but the section will continually write and take steps in furtherance of the stated policy of ABA. That's for sure. Well,
the section that you're the chair of was the originator of the full American Bar Association support for all the terms of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which includes a commitment to disarmament. And it was also that section which led in getting the resolution on the test ban. So God willing, under your chairmanship, we will be, more active in advocacy. And then we have Piers Corden on the phone, who is very, very closely involved with the advocacy of the Holy See, which is, under Pope Francis has been quite strong on the issue. Piers, do you want to lean in and tell us, what we can expect from the Holy See?
Well, thank you. I think if you follow what will be happening at the United Nations this fall at the high-level meetings, which I think are all going to be on Zoom or some equivalent, you'll see another statement to back up statements that the Holy See has been making now for some time, endorsing complete nuclear disarmament as promptly as possible, as well in the International Day Against Nuclear Testing. They'll make a strong statement urging the United Nations members as a whole to work with the remaining 8 states who need to ratify the CTBT for it to come into force. So I think that plus what Francis had to say already in 2017, and which he emphasized when he was in Hiroshima last November, that from his perspective at least, you cannot endorse even the possession of nuclear weapons as being moral. He basically has said the possession of nuclear weapons is immoral, and that by extension suggests that a security policy based on nuclear deterrence is not acceptable either, let alone use. So I think those are strong points, and I would hope that in the coming times, the Holy See can work with the United Religious Initiative that you mentioned to further the work at the United Nations as it relates to eliminating nuclear weapons. I want to make one more point back to what Jim Goodby was saying about confidence and security, confidence building measures, and that is that I think we underrate the fact that at the United Nations, you have a body called the United Nations Disarmament Commission, and it meets nominally every year. And on its agenda is transparency and confidence building measures to affect outer space. And every spacefaring nation is represented there, and it's an opportunity for a global collection of views and recommendations that could be applied to that endeavor, and it certainly seems to me like that would be an ideal way to move ahead on trying to keep the outer space environment available to humanity as a whole and not have it become an extension of global squabbles. So that's what I'd have to say.
Well, Pierce, let me say publicly, I am the ambassador on the subject for the Parliament of the World Religions. And of course, very active with the United Religions Initiative. And I'm very good friends with the Leadership of Religions for Peace and Charter of Compassion, and which is also working with them. And I can tell you, I know I'm not speaking out of school one iota. There's been much discussion of how we can coordinate more closely with the Holy See. And the only reason that I haven't been there is because of the COVID crisis, that otherwise we'd be at the mission, because Pope Francis on the subject is as eloquent, clear, decisive, and progressive as any voice we have on the planet. And I saw him we were there at the Vatican when he had a high-level conference on it, and it was nothing short of inspiring, absolutely. I want to end with, or give the floor a little bit to Natalie Balabhadra, one of our interns, who's somewhere in the United Kingdom, and she's the next generation, and I would like to hear Natalie's comments. These will be closing comments here. Natalie.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I'm Natalie. I'm an intern at GSI and I'm from London, studying at the University of Edinburgh. Thank you so much, Ambassador James Goodby. That was a very interesting talk. I wanted to ask you if you could talk more and perhaps elaborate on how the diplomatic negotiations, what the reality of those negotiations were, and how you facilitated them between Russia and Kazakhstan and Belarus and the former Soviet states. I'm really interested to know the environment, what kind of environment that was, how the negotiations went, and what kind of attitudes and behaviors you had to adopt as a negotiator for the US in those relations?
Thank you. The negotiations in which I was involved took place in 1993-94. President Yeltsin was in charge. He was not well. In fact, not too long afterwards, became fairly seriously ill. But while he was in charge and I was negotiating during those years, the relationship with Russia was really quite positive on the whole. We had some problems with the head of what became known as Rosatom, Mr. Mikhailovich, who was basically not looking at this as a geopolitical issue, but as an issue of finances for his ailing facilities. He was in charge of the nuclear program of Russia. And so we were able to negotiate with him an agreement to support facilities that would hold under international control dismantled nuclear warheads. And I thought that was a fairly important thing to achieve so that we could have what really would be irreversible dismantlement. So the relationship with Russia, I would say, was excellent. There were problems here and there. But towards the end, by the way, I was negotiating with a representative of the general staff of the Russian military, and we actually reached an agreement to transfer restricted data, that is to say, atomic energy information, to Russia reciprocally. It was enabled by the Congress that it was possible to do this, unprecedented with almost any country. We were on the verge of an agreement that would, I think, have led to a major negotiation. We even talked about where it would take place, about dismantling nuclear warheads. So we were that close to it. And then at that point, of course, Mr. Yeltsin did fall ill, seriously ill, and was unable to run the country any longer. And so they backtracked. The Russians never agreed to that in the end. But that's how close we were. It was sort of like Reykjavik. You talk about these things and you get so close. Mr. Schultz was fond of saying, "I've seen the promised land," and I saw the promised land too, but fate intervened. With Ukraine, it was a somewhat different matter. They were not quite sure that they wanted to give up their nuclear weapons. They felt that they might be threatened at some future time by Russia, which was prescient on their part, of course, but foreseeable. And there was a fairly important faction in the Ukrainian parliament that said we should keep these nuclear weapons because we will need them at some point. And so that had to be overcome, and finally it was overcome. I feel frankly a little bit guilty now, but they did agree to give up their nuclear weapons finally, and that was not just in return for material aid in helping dismantle their missiles that were on their territory, SS-18s, big ones, but also economic support and a form of political support. And it was agreed between Russia and the United States, and Britain and France also joined us, that we would not do anything to threaten the frontiers of Ukraine. Of course, that was violated, unfortunately. Belarus was an easy thing to do because the current president had not yet come into office, who had been the man who was in charge at that time was a physicist. They had recently at that time experienced a lot of radioactive fallout from the Chernobyl explosion, most of which fell on Belarus. And so they were ready for an agreement. And the big question there was, should we support a fairly large economic program that would amount to putting quite a lot of millions of dollars into a facility that would use the talents of nuclear engineers and so forth in civilian purposes. We got somewhere down in that direction, but not as much as the Belarusians wanted. But on the whole, it was an easy thing to do. Kazakhstan similar thing in the beginning. They wanted some security assurances from us. They felt that they were threatened by various countries, including China, I think. And so they were lobbying for an agreement which would be more or less like a NATO Article 5 sort of thing. We would come to your aid. We weren't ready to do that, but we were ready to give them some general assurances, which we did. Finally, they agreed to an agreement with us, which was implemented. So it was different, somewhat different in each case. The major difficulties at that time were not really geopolitical things. As I said, they were mainly on things like customs and liabilities and things of that type. But they were already, in those years, 1993, 94, I was really quite optimistic that the future of our relations with Eurasia were going to be in good shape. Of course, that all changed, regrettably.
Well, you know, on the note of highlighting a series of countries that actually gave up their nuclear weapons, I think the point of the Ukraine brings us right to today, where we promised them certain aid in their defense. The Congress of the United States, the Senate and the House, allocated several $100 million for that purpose. And the current man in the White House, President Donald Trump, withheld that aid in exchange for extorting help in his own personal political campaign, basically putting his political interests ahead of the interests of the dignity of the United States, living up to its promises, and the security of the region. I think this is a fact. We heard the testimony. There was no question that this is what he did. He was impeached for this. And so these issues, Ambassador, that you've told us about from just a few decades ago, let no one think that they are not of absolute daily relevance today. They are the fabric that make up the background of the world that we live in. And thus your expert testimony of the direction we need to go carries great weight. And I hope that all of us listening can carry the torch forward. We will be posting this on the GSI website and distributing it afterwards as much as possible, because I think your words of accuracy, historical accuracy, and wisdom of what we need to do carries great value. Ambassador,
Thank you, Jonathan.
I'd like to have a closing remark. I want to give you the floor.
Yeah, well, in the interest of historical accuracy, and I hate to say this, but what President Trump would tell you is that he authorized the sale of anti-tank missiles, lethal weapons to Ukraine, which the previous administration had not allowed. So there is almost always another side to these things, and I would not say there's another side in many of the things that we could talk about, but on that one there is a slight amelioration of the way you left it. So anyway, I'll stop right there by saying how much I have enjoyed this. I want to thank you all very much for being so patient and listening to all of this. And I would like to meet you individually again somehow. So please stay in touch with me through Jonathan or through anyone you can do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador.